He came into the world, and the world did not know him. Please be seated. Friends, the lectionary does something a little bit strange right now. If you were here on Christmas Day, you heard the exact same gospel reading. Because we are in the 3 days after Christmas, the traditional celebration that is the first Sunday after Christmas got bumped to tomorrow. But friends, I'd like to preach a little bit about the Holy Innocents. It's actually probably not a sermon that often gets preached in churches. We like to kind of blow over this rather horrific celebration. Because remember, in the story, what happens is that the three kings have gone to Herod and said, hey, there is a king that is being born. And Herod, not realizing this, is instantly afraid because his power is fragile, or perhaps Herod is fragile. And he says to them, oh, please, go find that king that I may worship him. But the three wise men who worship stars and learn from God's nature around them are told in a dream, do not go back to Herod, because Herod has no interest in worshiping this king. And so they return home by another way, and Herod, realizing that he's not going to get the information that he needs, decides that the best way to solve the problem is to kill all the boys under 2. The Feast of the Holy Innocents. This is an icon of Rachel weeping over the children at Ramah. If you have ever heard the song, oh, and the chorus, it just slipped my mind. Why weeping in and somebody knows it. There is a song that is very famous that I have completely blanked on, and I do not have it written down, about the weeping of the children whose heads are dashed on the stones as a part of the exile of Israel and the loss of their children in battle and war. This isn't exactly a Christmas topic. Perhaps that's why the lectionary in these first 3 days after Christmas bumped Holy Innocents to tomorrow. But I've been thinking a lot about the way in which God comes into the world. The Word comes into the world and is made flesh, and the world does not know God. And that reaction of fear that leads to violence. When we think that the way of the world that we understand is going to be disrupted and changed, so often our first response is violence. It's to get rid of it. That's what Herod is doing. He knows how the world works while he is in power, and the idea that a king might come, and clearly only to usurp him, even though it turns out Jesus has no designs on a throne anywhere, his first response is violence. Friends, that is the way of our world. We are afraid that we will not have enough to eat and enough jobs and enough health care, and so we get rid of those who seem to be in the way. I just spent this morning reading an article in the New York Times about the effect of immigration and anti-immigration on our country and the way that we choose to live together. And we all know that innocents Children, even, are put in cages and prisons. This is the grief of the world that we live in. Herod's event actually isn't terribly exceptional, as it turns out. And sometimes I think that we Episcopalians don't have a particularly good theology of evil. We really struggle to understand how the world around us can be so terrible. And I think, to be honest, some of it is because as Episcopalians we have been particularly privileged, and so we have not had to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. We have not had to suffer because we have had the means to survive. And so for some of us, we are experiencing a level of anxiety that for much of the world is actually quite normal. And it is hard. And sometimes I think in our theologies and the way that we talk about goodness and about sin and that we're really not all bad people, that we have a hard time understanding what happens and why it happens when innocents are killed, when bombs are dropped, when children die, when the elderly are left without health care. And I promise you, I'm not going to suddenly decide that I am going to readopt a theology where human beings are born depraved. I totally do not agree with it. I think it is a profoundly destructive theology. But it has made me reflect on the incarnation a bit more. What does it mean that the God of all creation takes on flesh? What I want is a God who takes on flesh and makes our flesh strong, armor against those slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. But that isn't what happens. God, becoming incarnate in a child, takes on the most vulnerable. The most vulnerable way to be. Doesn't come as an adult, but as a child. A child utterly dependent on parents, one of whom is an adopted parent. Utterly dependent on them and their community and their family to love them and protect them and shelter them and send them off to safety in a foreign land until everything calms down. Surely Mary heard the rumors, and even as she wanted to protect her own child, like Rachel, wept by the shores. And yet, babies still cry and sigh in happiness. And yet, people continue to care for and love one another. We hear amazing and beautiful stories where people do what it is that they were created to do. Not live in fear and not react in violence, but instead care for one another, provide shelter, take into their homes those who had no place to go. How many of you read Barbara Kingsolver's article about the opioid crisis, which just transferred to the children who were being cared for by their grandparents, by family members and members of the community around them because their own parents became addicted because they hurt their back at work? That is the incarnation, friends. That God comes, the creator of the universe comes and does not fix it all, but enters into us. The incarnation is not something that simply happened 2,000 years ago, give or take a couple decades. The incarnation is what God does in each and every one of us and through us. And it includes weeping. I have no doubt that Jesus heard the stories of what happened when he was young. I have no doubt that his parents told him about what it was like to go from Bethlehem to Egypt, hoping that nobody recognized that they had an infant on that donkey, trying to keep him quiet as they traveled roads populated by soldiers of Herod. I have no doubt that that shaped who Jesus was, the recognition of the vulnerability of what it is to be one of us and to not be recognized. God comes into the world, and because we are so distracted by kings, by pharaohs and Herods and pomp and circumstance and power and prestige, we are so distracted we cannot see where God is in the world. But friends, when we do see it, it is a different world. It is a different world because the response to the incarnation is not one where we're just glad that God showed up. But it is the response that Isaiah spoke of, the joy of recognizing the presence of God in and through one another leads us to be a people who come alongside and accompany one another without fear, who stand up for what is true and right and just in the world. And it may be done at great cost. Most of us are probably pretty sheltered from that cost. It may come at great cost, but the incarnation is the embodiment of a God who accompanies us. Not to fix us, not to make it all better by waving magic God fingers, but to accompany us as we become the incarnation of God in the world, as we recognize who God is and how God is and become that ourselves. That is the response to evil. And it may not succeed in the ways that we hope. And it may suddenly surprise us. When I was a senior in college, I was studying Russian because I wanted to be a foreign diplomat. And then the wall came down, and Russian was really no longer terribly useful. Suddenly it's a little more useful now, decades later. Things change because people resist. And that wall didn't come down just because of a political discussion and deal. It came down because people had been praying and gathering and resisting and insisting that this is not the world that they wanted to. The stories that came out after the wall came down about those acts of resistance were amazing. To be the incarnate God is to be a people who recognize and who, like God, enter into the fullness of our vulnerabilities so that we can accompany one another. That is the hope of this community, of every community, in the face of the innocents that cry out and the injustice in the world around us, is to recognize the presence of God and to become the ones who accompany one another. Amen.